Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana Campero, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. In the last few years, articles about Chinese companies pouring millions into Mexico have appeared in key international media. However, hard data does not yet provide such conclusive evidence. What is true is that the U.S. is, as it has been historically, the largest source of FDI in Mexico. In fact, according to the Mexican Economy Secretary, U.S. companies invested $15 billion in Mexico's economy in 2022, compared to only $0.3 billion invested by Chinese companies. To talk about what are the realities behind this narrative and the associated risks for Mexico to allow China to use it as the backdoor to the United States, that it is my pleasure to welcome Juan Carlos Baker, one of the key negotiators of the USMCA and the current CEO of Ansley International Consultants. Juan Carlos, welcome to Mexico Matters. It is truly my pleasure to have you on the show again, but this time to talk about the facts and the fiction of Chinese presence in Mexico. It is true that over the past 2 or 3 years, we have seen various Chinese companies making big investment announcements in Mexico. Just to give you a few examples, Linglong Machinery Group announced plans to invest about $5 billion. Trina Solar said that they wanted to invest $1 billion. Even BYD Auto said that they were eyeing a new assembly line in Mexico. Can you give us a sense of what is really happening?
Mariana, thank you for inviting me again. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that the last time that we spoke was when one of the North American Leaders Summit was taking place. It seems so long ago. Many things have happened since then, and one of the most important things that North America has been facing in these past 2 years probably is a shadowing figure of China all over. And to me, that springs basically from two reasons. One is that certainly China represents one of the very few consensus that exist among Washington. What I'm trying to say is that this political divide, I guess that blue and red legislators and governors and so on are understanding that China represents a significant, let's say, challenge for the US's hegemonic role in the world. And because of that, well, China is present in all the conversations happening in the US right now. And second, certainly because, as you correctly pointed out, there's been a recurrent insistence that China is now increasing its presence in Mexico. So let's put the second part in context. If you looked at Latin America, China, for a few years now, China is the largest trading partner and the largest investor for all countries in Latin America, except Mexico. Mexico, because of the NAFTA before, now the USMCA, geography and cultural ties, remains linked to the US and so far had resisted these attempts from China, these Chinese attempts to increase its presence in Mexico. But that changed, I would say, probably in the past 18 months. Because as the rhetoric in the US starts ramping up against China, and as the USMCA went into effect, and as the tariffs that Trump established 6 years ago now were kept by President Biden, it was clear to Chinese businesses that the only way that they could still go through the US or go to the US market was by finding alternative channels. And some of those firms, the ones that you mentioned and many others, have decided to make investments in Mexico in order to manufacture goods and export those goods to the US, other markets as well, and to serve the Mexican domestic market. Now, in here, we start getting into some shaky ground because, as you mentioned as well, the reality is that Chinese investment is not that significant in Mexico, even with these announcements and others that have been made. If you looked at the top 10 investors in Mexico, the first one is the US, the second one is Spain. Yeah, by far. And it's been like that for forever, really. The second is Spain. The third sometimes is Canada, sometimes is Korea. So down the road, this is what I'm trying to say. If you look at the top 10 investing countries in Mexico, China is not there. Now, that might change because if these announcements that were made start materializing, well, the expectation is that China is going to start climbing up the ranks as an important investor in Mexico. Now, is that good or bad? Well, it depends on who you ask. Certainly, people in Washington are keeping an eye on this, and I am convinced that if some of these companies come to Mexico, these Chinese companies come to Mexico, to make household appliances, sneakers, textiles, footwear, that kind of thing, maybe that is less of a concern than if the companies moving to Mexico are high-tech or the ones that can produce sensitive goods.
The Mexican government has said that the announcements of Chinese investments in Mexico last year amounted to about $6 billion. Compared to the U.S. investments in Mexico, it's actually really quite small. Moreover, is there a way to know if these announcements have actually materialized? That is, are Chinese companies or which Chinese companies are already breaking ground?
No, and that's precisely what makes all of these number dancing figures very suspicious. Because, one thing is the announcement and the actual construction or the actual start of operations of Chinese companies might take years to come. So from those announcements, it's hard to speculate because, companies are not obliged to report any of the progress that they are achieving their investments in Mexico. So you can only rely on anecdotal evidence. I will be very surprised if we see Chinese factories springing from one day to the next in the following 18 months or 24 months. I believe that those numbers that have been announced, some of them will crystallize in the next 2 years probably, but this idea, which is really the narrative that is catching on in the US, this narrative that there will be a tsunami of Chinese goods entering into the US, given all these investments in Mexico, clearly that is just not the case. And I don't want to get too technical into this, but let me just make a very small point here, because as I said, it's part of the narrative that is getting traction in the US. If a company comes to Mexico, uses local inputs, raw materials from the region, employs domestic Mexican workers, if the company pays taxes, it's a socially responsible company and fulfills the USMCA rules, for all intent and purposes, products manufactured by that hypothetical company are Mexican. And thus, the fact that they are exported to the US or Canada, for that matter, should be granting USMCA tariff-free privileges. Exactly. Now, if we try, because, all of this narrative goes to the fact that the origin of the capital is Chinese disqualifies those products from entering the US. If we take that assertion as true, then we are going to get into a lot of trouble, because then certain cars manufactured in Mexico are not going to be Mexican, are going to be Japanese or German or Korean.
Is there a government entity or a realistic way in Mexico to identify the origin of the capital?
Well, yes, there are ways for identifying the origin of the capital. In Mexico, under the foreign investment law, companies investing in Mexico must register before the Ministry of the Economy, and they have to fill out some paperwork on which the origin of the capital is included, right? So every company that wishes to start operations in Mexico goes through that process, so you can really identify if the money is coming from China or Canada or any other country. The problem that I see on that, though, is that I'm not a corporate financial expert, but it is clear to me that, companies sometimes set up their headquarters in one country, but their actual operations are in a third one. This sort of architecture, financial architecture, that allows for a company to have several subsidiaries or to have cross-holding vehicles, in a way, will not be captured by those statistics. It could be the case that a company, say a Chinese company or Korean or Japanese, is based in Australia, and thus the money registered in Mexico for that particular operation is registered under an Australian LLC, an incorporated company in Australia, regardless of the money being Chinese or Japanese or Korean in origin. So there is a way, But it's super fuzzy. And that is why I believe Treasury, the U.S. Treasury Department, has been in contact with the Mexican Ministry of Finance, Hacienda. And there's been talk, it's been reported in the press, there's been talk about Mexico, working with U.S. authorities to set up a screening mechanism for investments, which currently our country does not have, at least not in the same way that the U.S. does.
Yeah, I remember Janet Yellen being in Mexico not long ago and asking López Obrador to try to coordinate more closely how is Mexico screening foreign investors, right? Foreign investments. With the idea that the U.S. would like to prevent Chinese purchases of sensitive American technology and also concern about specific national security issues. How do you go about this?
To begin with, and I wrote a column on that newspaper in Mexico, column in El Economista, a Mexican specialized newspaper on those issues. One of my columns there, I wrote that there are two ways of looking at that approach or that intention desired by the U.S. On the one hand, if the intention is to have a much more strict screening with the Mexican authorities that allows to identify money flows derived from illegal activities, money laundering, arms trafficking, drugs, what have you. Well, all of that I see as a positive step forward. The reality is that the Mexican authorities lack the financial intelligence to track those movements all around. So certainly, capacity building from the U.S. in that sense could be helpful. And in a way, it's a shared responsibility, to be honest. Now, if the intention is, we need to start tracking down money flows coming from countries that are not necessarily aligned to U.S.'s national interest, that will be more problematic in Mexico, in my view, because our definition of what is national security in Mexico is still very traditional, military-like in the sense. In Mexico, the national security definition has not evolved so as to include economic, trade, technology, and other factors. In order to move in that direction, Mexico, in my view, would have to come up first with its own definition of what is national security, which obviously might take elements from what the U.S. believes is national security. But otherwise, it will be very hard in Mexico, in terms of public opinion, to sell, quote unquote, the idea that we are protecting U.S.'s interest in Mexico. Politically, it will be very complicated to handle for any future government. And thus, sorry for the gigantic look, but just to answer your question, I think that if this is a genuine effort to stop illicit activities, that is very good, and I'm all for it. The intention of this is, to have this extension of national security interest from the U.S. applied in Mexico. We need to think thoroughly what that implies for us. I'm not saying that we are not going to be on the same page with the U.S. I'm just saying that for that to happen in any case, we need to have a domestic, internal, deep reflection in Mexico and come up with our own definition and our own conclusions.
Let me go back to something you mentioned before. When you compare the nature of Chinese investments in other parts of Latin America to those happening in Mexico, traditionally, Chinese investments in Latin America, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, were mostly focused in raw materials and, maybe infrastructure. And now in Mexico, they're really focused on services and manufacturing. And also another difference is that it's mostly in Mexico, private Chinese companies. It's not SOEs, right? So what are the industries where we're seeing most Chinese investments or announcements?
Let me take two steps back on that. The Chinese investment in Latin America has, traditionally been raw materials, minerals, commodities, food, things like that, no? The fact that Mexico and China are manufacturing-driven economies, China much, much larger than Mexico's, but nonetheless very similar in nature, implied that that was one of the reasons why Chinese capitals were not that present in Mexico, because in a way we were competing with each other, against each other on foreign markets. Now, with all those conditions that I mentioned on an earlier comment, well, that is changing, of course. The elements or the industries that so far we have seen in Mexico, the Chinese companies coming to Mexico, have been manufacturing, light manufacturing, what I mentioned earlier, household appliances, TVs, some auto parts, certain construction equipment, machinery. There are a few Chinese companies participating in large construction projects in Mexico. It's been documented the participation of Chinese companies in the Tren Maya, for example, in southern Mexico. We have seen, I would say, manufacturing, traditional manufacturing, so to speak. It's very unknown, at least as of now, if the big high-tech Chinese firms are going to come to Mexico. Semiconductors, artificial intelligence, 5G. I mean, Huawei has a very strong presence in the country, but so far 5G has been out of its reach. I would say that it's more traditional manufacturing, the one that so far has been present in the country. That could change, of course, in the near future, but that's really what the picture looks like right now.
In the United States, Ambassador Tai is worried and has actually warned Chinese car manufacturers of trying to circumvent USMCA tariffs, right? Can you explain to us how the tariffs in the automotive sector work under USMCA, and how could Chinese companies circumvent these tariffs?
That's a very good question, Mariana, because as I was saying earlier, the narrative that is taking traction in Washington is misleading, to say the least. On the one hand, products traded in North America under USMCA rules need to meet what is called a rule of origin. That implies the percentage of regional inputs that need to go into the production of certain goods to be able to qualify for that duty-free treatment. In the case of automobiles, the rule is super strict. It demands a 75% of regional value content. It demands that certain auto parts, the engine, the chassis, and others also comply with their own rule of origin. It requires a particular percentage of steel and aluminum to be sourced from the region. It had some labor value content. So it's very complicated. That's what I'm trying to tell you. So right now, even though that there are no Chinese cars manufacturing facilities built in Mexico, even if they were here today, chances are that those companies would be unable to meet the rule of origin. There's this inflow of exports to the US, it's just not there. Now, if let's say that Ambassador Tai is thinking ahead of her time, and she says that this is not happening now, but it might be happening 2-3 years from now. And this takes us back to the comment that we were making earlier. If a company comes and sets up a facility in Mexico and fulfills all the USMCA requirements, why would such product not be granted duty-free tariff if it complies with the USMCA? If you wanted to discriminate against that product because of the origin of its capital, then you will have to amend the USMCA. Because otherwise, the way that it is written right now, as it stands right now, there's just no way, technically speaking, of course, that such circumvention is happening as those statements claim.
Juan Carlos, it's not only the investments, right? I mean, Chinese exports to Mexico have also increased significantly. According to global freight rate intelligence platform Cenita, Chinese container exports to Mexico rose nearly 60% last year. What are we mostly importing from China?
Inputs, electronics, garment, other elements that in the statistics they are going to show up as intermediate goods. That basically means that those are inputs that then are processed in Mexico to be re-exported, but again with a value added incorporated. So imagine that a Chinese company or a Mexican company or a Korean company, it doesn't matter, established in Mexico, imports from China a particular motherboard circuit, okay? By the way, that circuit or that product very likely paid a high tariff when it entered Mexico, because there is this missing piece sometimes in the narrative. Mexico does not have any free trade agreement with China. Goods coming in from China into Mexico pay tariffs, some of them as high as 50%. It's just that when those goods enter and the duty is paid and the Mexican company takes that motherboard to make a laptop, well, that's where the value added is, and that's the process where the rule of origin is met. And
do we export anything to China?
Yes, but very little. I mean, if you looked at the numbers, I would say that probably our trade with China, Mexico's trade with China, should be in the order of $120 maybe $130 billion. And of those, clearly China has the surplus. And what Mexico exports to China is basically commodities, meaning beef, avocados, food, tequilas, beer, other certain specialty products. It's not that much, really. Our trade with China is cemented on this supply chain role.
Mainly because of nearshoring, Mexico became the number one trading partner of the United States, right? Trade between the two countries is higher than with China or even Canada. But we also know that the word deficit is not really the favorite word of now candidate Trump. If the trade deficit between our two countries keeps on growing, do you estimate it to backfire?
Yes, that's the short answer is yes. The long answer is also yes, but let me tell you why.
Yes, and yes.
Yes. Look, obviously, all economists by training listening to this podcast have a good opinion on this, and people, sometimes uses the deficit card to imply that the trade is uneven or that another country is benefiting more than another country because of that deficit or surplus and who is recording it. Now, to me, the whole point of the USMCA was really to increase the regional integration of our value chains. The fact that Mexico is the largest provider of US goods is precisely a reflection of that. Okay? So in that sense, you can say that the USMCA has been successful because Mexico displaced China as a supplier to the US, and now the top two suppliers of the US are Mexico and Canada, friendly countries, neighboring countries that share values, and we are there with this experiment, 3 decades experiment on integration. Now,
and it's also the point of nearshoring or friendshoring or however.
Precisely, that was the whole point. So in a way, we are witnessing right now some decisions unfolding before us that were taken 5 or 6 years ago. That's the technical economic reality, trade reality that we know does not necessarily go hand in hand with the political reality. Now, clearly, I see candidate Trump is busy with other legal stuff, but when he goes back on the campaign trail, I am pretty sure that he's going to go to these arguments again that, he has used them before, and those arguments proved to be persuasive and proved to be convincing. So why not go back to them again? He will, I'm sure, capitalize on those. I'm not really so sure as to what the Democrat campaign could argue or could say in that sense. Maybe not on the part of the deficit, but probably the Democrats are going to argue that is why the Biden White House has put so much emphasis on the labor disciplines of the USMCA and how those are being applied to Mexico. If you looked at the number of cases initiated by the US against Mexico, by and large, the majority of those are related to labor disputes. So either because of the deficit...
What about energy?
Yeah. Energy, GMO, corns, what have you. I think that the USMCA and trade with Mexico is definitely going to be on the campaign on the two sides. Some of them might showcase Mexico in a different way, but this is not going to be an easy campaign for the USMCA or for Mexico on that matter. And that's unfortunate, given everything that Mexico contributes to the U.S.
Juan Carlos, you spoke briefly about tariffs. Mexico has recently issued a decree to increase tariffs on more than 500 goods, including steel, aluminum, textiles, and others. These tariffs, mostly aimed at China because we don't have a trade agreement with China, as you said, range from anywhere from 5 to 50%. What prompted Mexico to increase these tariffs?
Well, we can only speculate, of course. The official answer lies on the decree that was published on the 22nd of April, if I'm remembering by heart. There are 3 reasons why, in my opinion, the Mexican government did this. First, several industries in Mexico, steel, aluminum, construction, textiles, footwear, others, have claimed for years that they are unprotected from foreign competition and that the tariffs were way too low and that allowed the importation of gigantic quantities of products. So on the one hand, that benefited consumers because it kept inflation down, but the converse argument was that it was affecting those industries in Mexico.
Industry.
Yes. So reason number 1, it's been for a few years a constant demand from certain industries in Mexico that such increases took place. So the Mexican government responded to those claims. That's probably reason number one. Reason number two, it's much more simple. It's a collection issue. It's tax revenue collection issue because the López Obrador administration has a very large deficit, again, in this case, a fiscal deficit. So they're looking for money everywhere. And when you look at the numbers of what we were importing from non-FTA countries, you just do the math, and increasing 5%, 10%, 15% tariffs represents a couple of $100 million, which at the moment the Mexican government certainly could use. So reason number two, simple and pure revenue collection from the Mexican government. And the third, in my opinion, is that this is a token of good faith, a token of goodwill to the U.S. government. Because again, in this narrative that Mexico is serving as a springboard towards the U.S. market by Chinese and other companies, the fact that we were letting these imports go into Mexico so freely, quote unquote, well, that implied a loophole that certain companies were abusing. So by increasing the tariffs, Mexico could be seen as a responsive partner to the U.S. and one that takes into account the preoccupations of its largest trading partner. So again, we're just speculating, but for me, that will be the main three reasons. One, it was demanded by the industry. Second, it meant more resources and income from the government. And finally, in a way, you offer a token to the US. So what's not to like, from that decision?
Completely. Juan Carlos, however, Chinese manufacturers are flooding many countries with electric vehicles, with solar panels, with other goods, mostly due to massive manufacturing capacity and lack of consumption at home. Mexico just increased tariffs, as we said. What do you think would be the reaction if in many other countries when the Chinese products start impacting their own industries and jobs?
Well, as I said, the Mexican market, at least for, as you mentioned, electronic vehicles, solar panels, those are sort of high-end products. Chinese goods have been present in Mexico for decades now. But those are the low-quality, cheap products that you can find in street markets in Mexico and in other stores. The high-end, new technology, advanced Chinese products is just slowly making its way to Mexico. So right now, other than the anecdotal evidence, I would doubt very much that there is a proven, documented threat or harm to the domestic industry. And in fact, for example, you mentioned EV cars. Some of the EV cars imported into Mexico are actually being imported by large traditional manufacturers. General Motors, for example, BMW and others are manufacturing electronic vehicles in China for their own brands, and they're bringing those vehicles into Mexico. So yeah, BYD is doing it, Great Wall Motors is doing it, but so is GM, so is BMW and others. So it's hard to separate the wheat from the rest in that discussion. But clearly, the fact that China has a capacity so large, it means that at any moment, those numbers might change, and probably we will see a reaction in Mexico similar to what's been in other markets as well.
Yeah, because now you see in Mexico, a lot of the cars you see in the streets are Chinese EVs, which it's very surprising, right?
Yeah, and they are making a very good market entry, say, because, those are flashy new products unknown to the Mexican market, because the Chinese companies are very aggressive in pricing. They are very aggressive in marketing. Mexican consumers are not so easily convinced. But yeah, the fact is that those Chinese cars are competing affordable products vis-a-vis what Volkswagen, Toyota, or others could be. So yeah, we will be seeing figures for the first semester of this year in about 2 months from now. So I'm really interested in seeing how increase in domestic sales, because again, those are not cars that are being exported from Mexico. It's completely domestic. But I'm very curious to see how those figures, the sales figures, have evolved in this year.
Let me ask you about a very sensitive issue. steel.
as opposed to the other issues that we have just talked about.
Exactly. Steel is particularly sensitive in the United States, particularly so before an election, right? And this is not Mexico's first rodeo. If you remember in 2018, of course, you were there. But we're now seeing a few senators proposing legislation known as the Stop Mexico Steel Surge Act. They basically want to reinstate certain tariffs on Mexican steel. Can you give us a picture of how does the Mexican steel industry looks like, and what do we export to the United States?
Yeah, I remember those talks vividly. I was recently talking to a friend of mine that also participated in the negotiations, and he was telling me, recounting all these stories about long negotiating hours in the White House, so on and so forth. And I was very puzzled. And afterwards, I said to this friend, "You know what? I remember things differently. Eh? I don't remember. I don't have this romantic idea as others now are suggesting. Ambassador Lighthizer in his book also. I mean, I do concur with most of what he says, but maybe because I was in the trenches, my recollection of that is different. Anyway, still, yes, definitely, but very fulfilling, and I feel very proud for what we did. Still, now we have to remember that the steel market in North America is super concentrated. There are only a few firms in each country. I don't think that altogether Mexican, Canadian, and U.S. steel firms are maybe more than 20, 25 companies altogether. So it's a market that is very concentrated. It's a market that, has had a very rough years. I mean, construction stopped altogether during COVID, and these guys were already in a rough patch back then. It's not uncommon that the industry launches these accusations and these requests for measures to their own domestic government in order to have that edge that allows them to compete better with Chinese, Russian, Turkish, South African firms, steel firms, Indian too. So what is the present situation right now in North America? Remember, President Trump set some tariffs on the steel and aluminum sector based on the now infamously known Section 232 national security. Okay? So it applied to every country, but Mexico and Canada at the beginning were exempted. And then that changed. The U.S. imposed tariffs. Mexico retaliated, so did Canada. And in the end, there was an agreement that is called the joint statement. It's super generic, but that's what it's called. The joint statement, which basically allow for a truce, remove the tariff as long as certain limits on steel were respected and were not overpassed, of course. Now, in those products, what's in there? It's the steel sheets, semi-finished products, mesh, other very basic steel manufacturing products. Limits were set. And the present accusation, which relates back to that letter that you were mentioning, is that the Mexican government is not doing the monitoring that it should on those exports from Mexican companies to the U.S., and hence, given that there is no certainty right now of how much steel is being introduced, then tariffs should be reinstated. That is the whole background on this. Now, what the Mexican industry says is that it's actually the other way around. That if you looked at the year-to-year numbers, it is the U.S. companies, the ones who are increasing or surging their exports to Mexico. So in any case, it should be the Mexican government placing tariffs in the U.S. companies. So all of this just goes on and on and on and on. To me, to be super honest, this is an issue, a technical issue that just got political attention given the elections in the two countries, that really is completely and absolutely unnecessary to be involving this high-level decision-making to the picture. This could be resolved, in my opinion. Just get the right people in the room, get them to look at the statistics, and get them to see and clearly track down what steel is coming from and take the appropriate decisions. But, issuing these very theatrical calls for tariffs to be imposed again, that is really not going to do any good to anyone. And honestly, it's just distracting the decision makers from focusing on issues that are more important to the industry right now, such as, carbon emissions, the transition to cleaner energy, the fact that there are still way too many projects to be fulfilled given IRA and other legislation passed in the US that need steel. So this is just a distractor in my mind. I do understand the nature of the complaint, and I do understand that this is political for several reasons. But to me, is we are missing the forest by looking at one single tree.
Juan Carlos, we're almost at the end of this episode, but I cannot let you go without asking you, what are your expectations for the 2026 USMCA?
Review.
Not renegotiation. Review. Okay.
No, let me, I mean, obviously jokes apart. Let me tell you why I'm super insistent on this review versus renegotiation. It's not semantics. It is semantics in a way, but when you speak about renegotiation, it means that everything's on the table. It means that the deal, in of itself, the deal is under question, right? When you speak about review, it means that you have an instrument, you have a vehicle that you will just fine-tune or adapt for better performing. But, the existence of the vehicle itself is never questioned. So let's get into the substance from that point. So to me, the expectations are, I have the super optimistic scenario, shiny, sunny scenario, unicorns, and so on. I have the very pessimistic scenario, which is in the gloomy other side of the spectrum. And I have the realistic scenario. Let's start with the optimistic. The optimistic scenario would be that this is a technical process driven by experts. That you have, the ministers, USTR, the Ministry of the Economy, the Canadian Minister of Foreign Trade, appointing a very capable and very wise group of people that they look at the agreement, make consultations here and there, come up with a few ideas on what could be upgraded, maybe a few new ideas, I don't know, artificial intelligence or what have you, that need to be regulated from the North American point of view, and then off they go and nothing happens. That's probably not going to be the case. The intermediate scenario is one in which, yes, this happens, this architecture is crafted, these people are appointed and invited, and this group of wise North American men and women have consultations with stakeholders. They collect a long list of issues that need to be addressed, but then the politics get in. It's really unthinkable that with everything that's been said and done, there will be no ideas on how to make the USMCA stricter for several issues. That could be China, that could be labor, that could be the environment, energy, GMOs, automotive. So that certain political groups make a pressure sufficient enough so that proposals by each country become politically driven and not technically driven. Now, that's probably going to be the most realistic case. I'm not saying that it's going to be a certain doom if we go on that path, but we need to keep it manageable. I'm also an associated fellow of the Americas Institute at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I wrote a paper there that argues that because that's probably going to be the most likely scenario, the one that I'm describing, we need to come up very quickly with definitions on who the participants are, so which ones are the topics that are going to be addressed, how long is the process going to be, and what comes after. I mean, there needs to be some follow-up.
Yeah, so it's basically the framework. Yeah.
The framework, the participants, those details that right now, because it's 2024, those details right now seem to be light years away. But in reality, they're just around the corner. That scenario probably, I'm afraid, is the most likely scenario that we are going to see. The question there remains on how manageable we can keep it. Now, the worst possible scenario in my mind is that countries start approaching this review exercise from what I call the deconstructing castle theory. Meaning, imagine this, there's this castle, right? And castles, as anyone who's listened that has kids, the Lego castle is being built. putting one block on top of the other. That's what we've been doing with the USMCA, before that with the NAFTA. But if the approach that the countries decide to follow in 2026 is, you know what, I don't like the automotive Lego being placed in there anymore, so I need you guys to remove it. What's going to happen is that the other countries are going to answer, you know what, that's actually a very good idea because I don't like the energy Lego be on that same wall. And then another country is going to say...
The dairy Lego.
Dairy, yeah, just to say any other product, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So what we are going to have is, a process that it's not really a review. It's a process to deconstruct the agreement. And to me, that is the worst possible scenario because we are going to be killing the golden goose.
North America.
And we're going to be killing the idea of North America. That's really true. That's really how I imagining right now the process. But it's urgent. It's urgent, Mariana, that we start talking about this, that we start having seminars, that we start having calls for papers, that we have the business organizations getting together with North American counterparts. We need to feel again. I'm not wishing for this, but I'm just seeing no other option. We need to feel again that very real possibility that we felt back in 2017 when we suddenly found ourselves at the very possible situation that the NAFTA was no more. And that prompted a series of actions and activities that, brought us where we are right now. So we need to feel that again, because if we fall into the comfort zone, we already lost the momentum on this.
Juan Carlos, unfortunately, I'm going to have to close on that very gloomy note.
No, don't.
But hoping that we learned the lesson back there, right? And that we're really going to get those group of experts that, we really need to put on the table and really make this a stronger North America.
That's precisely what I always rely back to, people that invite me to talk to my students, people that, my columns, what have you. By any metric that you wish, the USMCA has been great success. By the numbers, by the investment, by the way that it positioned North America as a strategic hub in the post-COVID-19 pandemic world, by the way that North America has been resilient to geopolitics. I mean, it's much more than what we could have expected 5 or 6 years ago. So instead of looking at, how do we restart North America, I always prefer...
How do we strengthen North America?
Yeah, how do we strengthen North America? And how do we make the USMCA become this bar, this threshold against which all other projects are measured? There are already some countries asking and knocking on the door to be considered as potential USMCA members. Costa Rica is doing its part. Costa Rica will be ready to join, in my opinion, but others as well, Uruguay and so on. So, we must be doing something good in North America. Sometimes we're blinded by the day-to-day, but we must be doing something good so that other countries are coming to our shores and asking to be invited as well. So I'm always trying to think on that and see what we can do better rather than the other negative political current situation.
Thank you so very much for this very insightful conversation. I hope you come back to Mexico Matters and hope to see you soon.
I will. Anytime that you invite me, every time that you invite me, I will be here. Thank you so much. My pleasure.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog